Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. My name is Holly Grand, and I work with Texas Parks and Wildlife Division's Coastal Fisheries Division, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's Coastal Fisheries Division. I'm going to be facilitating the webinar here this evening. But before we get into the presentation, I do have a few reminders that I want to go over before we get started. Your cameras, microphones, and chat are all going to be disabled during the webinar tonight. If you have any questions about the proposal, please use that Q&A feature that you can find at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. We're going to be answering questions at the end of the presentation, but if you have a question at any point during the presentation, please type it in then. If you would like to provide comments about the proposal being presented this evening, they must be submitted through our online portal, through email, phone, or mail. We're not going to be recording any comments that you send to us through Zoom today. You're going to be receiving a follow-up email from Zoom with the information about how and where to submit your comments about the proposal so that they can be recorded. Our preference is going to be through that online portal. You'll have a link to that at several locations. And again, that QR code that was playing earlier will also be shown a little bit later in the presentation too. In the email that you're going to receive tomorrow, you're also going to find a link to our YouTube channel where you will be able to access a recording of tonight's webinar. That recording will be uploaded and published to YouTube within 24 hours of this hearing tonight. So you'll be able to access it there or through our Facebook page. So make sure to keep up with us that way. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to our presenter here this evening, Dacus.
Good evening, everyone. This is Dacus Giesland. I'm the Deputy Director here at Coastal Fisheries Division within Texas Parks and Wildlife. Let me go ahead and I'll share my screen. We'll get going. Hey, Holly, can you see that?
No.
Okay.
There you go. You're good.
How about now? All right, there we go. Let me do a couple things here, gang. I'm going to move over a Q&A box. All right. Again, welcome everyone. This is a public hearing this evening. This presentation will include proposed changes to fishing regulations regarding spotted sea trout. Before we get started, I do want to introduce my team, our team here. Holly Grand is with our outreach. She's our outreach and education specialist. Perry Trial is our Lower Coast Regional Fisheries Management Director. Dr. Tiffany Hopper is our Science and Policy Chief, and Hannah Bauer is our Data Analyst. All right, so typically we present these proposals at our March meeting that will then subsequently be enacted or take effect in the next license year. That license year would begin on September 1, 2022. However, the commission will be voting on the adoption of this proposal at the January 26th Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission meeting, and the regulations would then go into effect sometime in mid-March, and I'll talk about the why that we're proposing this a little bit earlier than our typical statewide cycle. But again, this evening, the proposal addresses the special spotted sea trout rules and associated proposal. So everyone will certainly recall the freeze of February 2021, Winter Storm Uri. That event led to prolonged freezing temperatures throughout the state and especially on the Gulf Coast that were especially impactful to our marine life. This resulted in a die-off of nearly 4 million fish along the Texas coast. And that estimate is strictly a minimum estimate. We know that our fish kill assessments are an underestimate. So we know that there were probably more than that 4 million fish that succumbed to the freezing temperatures. Immediately after the freeze, our staff, our team surveyed the coast to assess the extent of the fish kill. And while 90% of the fish killed were non-game fish, an estimated 160,000 spotted sea trout were lost coastwide. Again, that's a minimum estimate. But the majority of those fish that we observed in that fish kill assessment came from the Laguna Madre systems. And the impact of that freeze and the resulting fish kill led the Parks and Wildlife Commission to take emergency action. And if you all will recall, that emergency action became effective April 1st of 2021. Conditions of the emergency action were the following, and they're specific to spotted sea trout. We enacted a 3-fish bag limit, a slot limit size of 17 to 23 inches, with no fish retained over 23 inches. And these emergency actions were only applied to the upper and lower Laguna Madre Bay systems. That emergency action expired on September 27th, 2021, and currently we are back to the previous statewide regulations of a 5-fish bag with a 15 to 25-inch slot with 1 fish able to be retained over 25 inches that counts as part of your 5-fish bag limit. That's our current statewide trout regulation. So in order to really assess or evaluate the impacts of the freeze on the spotted sea trout populations coastwide, we used our spring gillnet catch rates. Then this fishery independent data allows us to compare the sea trout abundance to 45 years of historical abundance data specific to each bay system. The spring gillnet season runs for 10 weeks from April to June of each year. And the graph here shows the mean or the average spring gillnet catch rates for the entire coast since 1976. The y-axis here is the catch rate, what we refer to as the catch per unit effort. That's the catch rate and number of fish caught per hour. And the x-axis, as you see down at the bottom, is the time series in years. I want to draw attention to that orange horizontal line running across the graph. That is the 10-year mean coastwide catch rate. The 10-year average catch rate we felt is more representative of our current regulatory structure and really allows us to compare the 2021 catch rates to a more recent history, if you will. You'll also note over here on the far end of the graph, the absence of the data from 2020. Due to COVID, we weren't able to get out and sample for our spring gillnet, so that is a missing piece of the data set that we weren't able to capture in 2020. But as you can see up here in this gray box, our 2021 coastwide catch rate is 20% lower than that 10-year mean, that orange line. And coincidentally, it's also 20% lower than our last data point in 2019, which hovers right on that line. All right, so we also look at the spotted sea trout population by each bay. The graph here shows the differential, kind of the plus and minus in 2021 catch rates compared to that previous 10-year average. For each individual bay system, graphically displayed here, almost every bay system you see saw a decline in catch rates. Based on our freeze kill estimates, we expected to see those larger declines in the lower and upper Laguna Madre bay systems on the bottom of the graph. But we also saw large declines in the middle coast, notably Matagorda, including East Matagorda and San Antonio bays. The one anomaly here is Corpus Christi Bay, where we actually saw an increase in catch rates, 9.3% based on looking at the last 10 years. There were possibly more, we feel like there were possibly more thermal refugia or areas where those fish could hide or seek refuge during the freeze, simply because it's a deeper bay system and resulted in a relatively low fish kill. So the declines you see in this data set, and based on our spring gillnets, that's the information that really is helping guide some of the proposal that you're going to see here tonight. So on January 26th, later on this month at the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission meeting, our staff will present the following recommendations for adoption to the Parks and Wildlife Commission. As stated at the beginning of the meeting, this will enable us to pursue an abbreviated timeline So this rule would be in place before the April spawning season. And that's really the reason that we're proposing this change now, as opposed to our normal statewide cycle where we would approach the commission in March. We wanted to get this in place prior to this beginning of the spawning season in April. So these recommendations are the same as the past emergency rule that went into effect in April 1st, 2021. And those are a 3-fish bag limit, a 17 to 23 inch slot limit with no fish over 23 inches. Now, these rules differ somewhat from the emergency rules in the geographical areas covered. If you'll remember, the emergency action only applied to the lower Laguna Madre and upper Laguna Madre. This new proposal will extend from the lower Laguna Madre north through East Matagorda Bay, and I'll show a map depicting this area in the next slide. Please also note that we are recommending, and this is a key point to this proposal, that we are recommending the rule expire or sunset on August 31st, 2023, and revert back to the previous rule of a 5-fish bag limit and 15 to 25 inch slot. Again, this would provide 2 spawning seasons to occur under these more restrictive harvest regulations. As this rule is in response to the freeze event, we anticipate that the population will have significant time to recover after 2 years, but we'll also continue to monitor those stocks. And based on previous freeze events back in 1983 and 89, if you all remember, those are our benchmark large fish kill events. And what we saw based on the recovery rates of those incidents, those freeze events, is on average, it took 2 to 3 years for the catch rates to recover following those events. So we decided on these recommendations based on the data on hand and the projected benefits, and I'll spend the next couple of slides breaking down each component of that proposal. All right, now this proposal differs again from the emergency rules in the areas that are affected. Here on the larger map on the left, we can see a map with the proposed boundaries. Moving from the south to the north, this would include water of the lower and upper Laguna Madre, Corpus Christi Bay, Aransas Bay, San Antonio Bay, and all the way through Matagorda Bay. Shifting focus to the bottom right map, this really illustrates the lower boundary of the Rio Grande River in Cameron County and the waters of the Gulf of Mexico extending 500 yards. So this regulation does include the Gulf beachfront up to 500 yards into the Gulf. The top right map shows the proposed northern boundary at FM 457 in Matagorda County. Now, these areas were selected due to lower gillnet catch rates that we observed in the spring in the lower coast and San Antonio and Matagorda Bays. Corpus Christi and Aransas Bays were included despite their higher gillnet catch rates for several reasons. And the first really was a concern over shifting fishing pressure, the notion that folks may select one bay system over another given less restrictive bag and size limits. There's also evidence of genetic connectivity, these fish moving between bays that could aid in population recovery. We recognize that's a valuable component of recovering from the freeze event. And also we consult with our game wardens, and simply out of ease of enforcement and consistency with the emergency action, our proposals, we considered that ease of enforcement and considering the geographic area in this proposal. So when we crafted the bag and slot limits, our team of scientists ran several modeling projections, population projections, on how different bag and size limit restrictions would really affect the spawning stock biomass. And spawning stock biomass is really a metric that includes both the number of fish and the relative size or their weight. And we use this as an indicator of the status of a particular stock of fish and its reproductive capacity. And that gives us an idea of, when you establish those those spawning stock biomass goals, it gives you an idea of the recovery rate for this particular stock. For the bag limit, we selected a 3-fish bag limit. And as you can see with the star, that results in a 6% increase to the spawning stock biomass. So our bag limit impacts, or the bag limit restriction, also is additive with any type of changing size slot. So here are the projections on how changing the slot limit, the y-axis, you got the various different size slot limit options, how that increases the spawning stock biomass. And that's on the x-axis, that percent increase in the spawning stock biomass. Again, Parks and Wildlife staff selected the 17 to 23 inch slot, as it was a less restrictive limit and still offered a significant increase to the spawning stock biomass at 21%. Additionally, the majority of our current spawning biomass are in that 12 to 17 inch range. And these regulations really relieve fishing pressure from that group, from that cohort of fish. Now, I want to address a couple of questions that have come our way. We've received several questions as to why select the 17 to 23 inch slot as opposed to a smaller slot. For example, the 15 to 20 inch slot. And you can see that down in that first green bar there. Anglers and commenters have noted that larger fish produce more eggs. And while this is true, the largest number of reproductively mature fish, again, is in that 12 to 17 inch size range. So you get a lot more fish within that 12 to 17 inch size range. And again, really comprises the bulk of the spawning biomass. So that simply there's a greater return on investment with that 17 to 23 inch slot limit if your goal is to recover back to, pre-freeze catch rates. A bag limit of 3 fish, again, will increase the spawning stock biomass by 6%. So together, again, these are additive. Together, the proposed rules sum to increase the spawning stock population by 27%. Essentially, these rules will leave more fish in the water for 2 spawning seasons, increasing spawning, recruitment, and really bolster recovery after the freeze. Another benefit of the rules is that the anglers in the Laguna Madre Bay systems, they've already been accustomed to these rules as they fished under the emergency actions, as they mirror those of the emergency rule. So before we hop into answering a few questions that you all have submitted on the chat, I want to remind everyone of the in-person public hearings that we have going on this week along the coast. We have meetings scheduled for tomorrow in Corpus Christi and Port Isabel. We have a public meeting scheduled Wednesday in Rockport and Thursday in Port Lavaca. And as you can see on this slide, we've got the times, the dates, and the locations. Each of those meetings start at 6 p.m., scheduled to last till 8 p.m. if necessary. And you can find those links on our website at tpwd.com. So for all those that are joining us in the evening, I want to encourage you to submit your public comments through the web portal linked here in the web link and within this QR code. I'm going to leave that up for a minute so folks can snap that with their smartphone. Or you also have the option, you can send your comments to us via email at our CFish account. That's cfish@tpwd.texas.gov. And before we kind of start with the Q&A session, we'll kind of look through the chat. We're gonna entertain those questions that are relevant to this proposal, and we'll kind of answer those as a team and hand those questions off. But I do want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. Again, encourage you to share your comments with us through our online web portal or email or phone calls. And those comments we've summarized, and we'll be presenting those to the commission later on in January. So with that, I'm going to leave the QR code up for a minute, but we're going to kind of look through some of the questions and see what we have here.
So Dacus, the first question is, can we restrict the number of trips per day or per month the guides will take? It'll be easier for them to get limits with the limit being 3, so they may take multiple trips per day. So the commission has the option of adopting the proposal as is, rejecting the proposal, or adopting it with modifications. So certainly if they chose to, they could add additional restrictions, but typically they don't. Any modifications that they adopt are less restrictive than the original proposal. So for something like that would be more restrictive, we probably wouldn't want to do that without going out for some public comment on that particular rule. So that would probably end up being a separate action if we were to do something like that.
Thanks, Barry. So we've also got a question here, and the question reads, I know you've talked about spawning biomass, but can you also touch a little on the fecundity of various size classes of fish, 12 versus 17, 23-inch fish? So fecundity simply means the ability or the capacity to produce eggs. So as you would expect, that 12-inch fish really is, the trout can produce 100,000 to approximately 1,000,000 eggs. So that 12-inch fish, you'd expect again to produce probably that smaller 100,000. And female trout, they're reproductively mature right about that 12-inch size class. So you'd expect the low end of it, lower fecundity at that size range. Up to the larger sizes, the trophy trout sizes in the upper 20s, you'd expect about 1,000,000 eggs. But really, again, you have so many more fish in that 12 to 17-inch size class as opposed to those larger fish. So just as a multiplier, the numbers of fish times the number of eggs, you end up with more eggs and more spawning biomass capacity or potential by protecting that smaller cohort or group of fish. So we've also got somebody suggesting, and this is more of a comment, to offer a trout tag for one fish over 25 inches per angler per year, so a person could retain a trophy. I would encourage you to include that in your comments as you submit those online.
There's a comment in the chat asking, when was the survey taken? Can there be more surveys taken to see how this trend is going throughout the year? So this data was mainly from the spring gill nets of 2021, but TPWD does go out twice a year in the spring and the fall for 13 weeks to collect this data. So we do have the fall 2021 data, and we'll continue that through 2022 and 2023. So we'll be able to monitor these populations closely and hopefully see an upward trend with that.
Thanks, Hannah. We've also got a question in the chat. Do we believe the kill numbers represent Matagorda? We know that the Matagorda system was severely underestimated, and really that boils down to the dynamic nature of that freeze event. If you all remember that wasn't just a day or two of freezing temperatures, that was a week long event. And some of our folks were impacted personally by the freeze, and they were dealing with their homes, dealing with busted pipes. So while we did have fish kill assessments in Matagorda, we simply couldn't get out there every day and count. And some days they may have been out there, and the kill really hadn't manifested itself to the peak of the kill. So some of those fish may not have been on the shoreline or had been floating yet. So no, we recognize that the fish kill assessment was severely underestimated in Matagorda, and consequently that bore itself true in the spring gillnet samples.
So we have a question here. It says, have you considered restricting the bag limits leading up to and through the spawning season of spotted sea trout? Presumably, what the person asking the question is getting at is if we could during the non-spawning season have the old rules. The spawning season for spotted sea trout is very protracted spawning season. It begins in the spring, early spring, and it goes all the way through summer and into fall. So yes, it would be possible. The commission could certainly consider something like that, but really we would, most of the year is taken up with the spawning season for trout.
Thanks, Perry. And again, gang, we're going to answer those questions that we determine are relevant to the proposal at hand tonight. There's some other questions in the chat that maybe necessarily aren't relevant to the proposal that we're moving forward with. We'll give this just a couple more minutes. I'm kind of screening through the questions. Team, if there's any of those that you'd like to answer, feel free to do that. We've got a question here. Does TPWD know the population of fishermen and guides for the major fish kill freeze, and the population of fishermen and guides for the current freeze? This is significant along with technology advances. That's a good point. We know there are more people by default. The population is certainly increased, and as the proportion of anglers is probably the same as it was, or relatively consistent throughout time. We know that there are more fishermen and more guides and more folks utilizing the resource.
So we have another question here. Southwest Florida has taken a catch and release standard for a couple of years after their red tide events. Has this option been weighed for a faster recovery of Texas bays? If so, why only the limited bag limit when a catch and release only would provide a faster bounce back? So certainly catch and release would provide a bigger benefit to increasing spawning biomass than simply a restricted bag limit. But when we looked at this, and DACA showed earlier the various scenarios and the contribution to spawning biomass of each one of those scenarios, we had to kind of weigh opportunity as well as the benefit to the population. So we really don't want to completely take away opportunity. We just would like to try to get a boost to the population to help speed recovery along. So it's really a balance between opportunity for fishermen and biological impacts.
Got a question regarding law enforcement and any feedback on compliance with emergency rules for the upper and lower Laguna Madre last year. Certainly there were some, some violations during that emergency action time frame, but by and large, our law enforcement has indicated that the anglers were very compliant with those changing regulations, and that's all part of the ability to get that message out and really educate our anglers and community members through the various means, and let them know that there has been a change in regulations. But yes, our law enforcement did respond that did get resounding compliance with those. Of course, there's always a few bad actors in every group.
I would add to that too, that we looked at the data we got from our harvest surveys. We saw good compliance there as well. Most of the fish were over that 17-inch limit that were landed.
We have a question. Are you all actively monitoring the redfish biomass and how it's doing with this trout freeze kill impending moratorium? We have looked into that, especially after the freeze. We looked at the stocks of many of the fish in the bays, and the redfish seemed to do well. And we also looked at some of our harvest data to try and see if there was any shifting pressure onto redfish. And that's not a concern for us right now, but we'll continue to monitor that throughout this period.
We had another question about basically why not go with the 16 to 20-inch slot that seemed more productive. Same answer. It's really a matter of trying to balance opportunity for fishermen and biological benefit to the population of spotted sea trout.
Got a question that asks, are there any options to extend the reduction after the 2 years are up? I could say that right now we feel that 2 years is an appropriate time frame for, based on the historic, freeze events that we've saw in the past, that 2 years is an appropriate time frame to recover catch rates to pre-freeze levels. However, our folks are out, every month doing different types of fisheries independent and fisheries dependent sampling. We'll continue to monitor, just like we do with all the other fin fish and particularly sport fish. We'll continue to monitor those populations throughout time. We're not going to stop monitoring.
Okay, we have a question. Why wasn't Galveston included? Just make it easy, make it statewide. And why wasn't the emergency rule for the lower and upper Laguna Madre extended? I heard it ended in back to 5 trout. So for the first part of that question, we just did not see the impact from the freeze in Sabine Lake and Galveston Bay systems. So we didn't feel like it was necessary to restrict harvest in those areas based on the impact of the freeze. For the second part of that, there's a very specific time frame in statute for those emergency rules. We can't extend them beyond a certain point. So we put that emergency rule in place. It was in place as long as it could be by statute. And beyond that, we need to go the route we're doing right now and make a formal proposal.
So we've got a question in the chat. If the goal of recovery effort to get us back to average or to exceed it? And at this point, our goal is to get us back to those pre-freeze catch rates. And as you can see, coast-wide, over time, we've been hovering right around that average. And I would say, trending upward over time. And that's a reflection of some of the regulatory changes we've seen, some of our stocking enhancement efforts, and really just an improvement in the fishery. So I think it's more it's appropriate to set that goal to pre-freeze catch rates. And I wanted to mention something I didn't during the presentation. I meant to, and I'll do that now. Our hatchery team is really, in fact, they've tripled. They have not just doubled down their effort; they have tripled their effort in generating our spotted sea trout within our hatcheries, both at our Marine Development Center and in Corpus and our Sea Center facility there in Lake Jackson. To date, our 2020 numbers, gang, just a little throwing some numbers out there. 2020 numbers were right at about 3 million spotted sea trout. Our 2021 numbers, 10.2 million spotted sea trout. 2.4 million of those went to the Laguna Madre system. 1.9 million went to Aransas Bay. To West Matagorda, 2.6 million. East Matagorda, 1 million. San Antonio Bay, 1.1 million. So our folks have really, responded quickly in our efforts to produce and rear and produce more spotted sea trout and supplement the, and that's part of the strategy of this recovery also, is really to, again, not only double down, but triple down on our enhancement efforts. And our hatchery team's been able to do that.
There's a question: if Matagorda had one of the worst catch rates on the gill survey, why wasn't Matagorda included in the emergency act? That emergency action was based on the kill estimates we had immediately following the freeze. And I think Dacus addressed this earlier, about it's possible that we underestimated the kills in Matagorda, but we didn't have that information at the time when the emergency action was implemented. Now that we have this data that's out a little bit from the freeze event itself, we're able to better assess how that event influenced these populations. We have more data points than we do for that initial fish kill survey. So we're able to use that information for this proposal here.
So we've got a question: through a formal proposal, what would you estimate the start date of this reduction? Again, that's the reason why we're following this kind of accelerated regulatory process. And on the screen, I pulled up kind of a conceptual timeline. That first date will actually go before the commission on January 26th. And conceptually, and this is kind of working through the fastest timeline possible, we could have a rule that goes into effect as early as March 10th. So really shooting for that mid-March timeframe, again, to get in front of that April initiation of spawning. So somebody's asked about the surf side. Why is the surf side also included in the proposed changes if that is typically a separate population? If I understand correctly, it may take pressure off the bay systems. Really, those aren't separate populations. When we think about, and we've run the genetics on this and continue to look at genetics not only as a fisheries management strategy, but also within our hatcheries. We really see three management units on the Texas coast: that northern area, Sabine and Galveston, the central, that's kind of the East Matagorda all the way down to Corpus Christi, and the Laguna Madre. And we know that those fish move in and out of the bay inlets or the passes. Some fish that get out into the Gulf and make those movements referred to as tide runners or surf runners. We know those fish utilize those areas and move in between bay systems. So that's why we determined we needed it, because it's a vital part of the fishery. Is really the reason why we'd include that area along the Gulf.
Okay, there's a question asking about is Texas Parks and Wildlife confident that the numbers of speckled trout in the Galveston Bay complex was properly represented, or could it be a Matagorda Bay scenario? Yeah, the answer is yes, we are pretty confident. We had very low fish kill estimates, but then subsequently, as Hannah mentioned earlier, when we did our spring gill nets, we also didn't see a big reduction in the gill net catch rates in Galveston Bay, where we did see that in Matagorda. So we're confident.
So there's a question asking about the non-game fish, and that would remember that was as part of our fish kill assessment. 91% of the fish we observed that succumbed to those freezing temperatures were not game fish. So this is a good question. What is the impact of the smaller bait fish and the overall game fish population? Really, what we've seen in the past is some of this can serve as a really kind of a fertilizing event and really feed and boost some of the bay systems, with decomposition of some of those fish and other critters consuming those. There's a lot of bait fish out there. There's a lot of non-game fish out there, and certainly we would see that in some of the condition and the relative weights, if you will, the weight per given length of a fish, that we've seen in some other fisheries. But really, we're going to continue monitoring those conditions of fish, and we also collect those non-game fish in our bag seines and our bay trawls. So we do have a way to continue to evaluate those, and we do monitor those as well.
The question about when will we release fingerlings into the bays, or have they already been released? Spotted sea trout stocking occurs in the summer mostly, and for 2021 that was already completed, but we'll be releasing fingerlings again in 2022 as we do every year.
So Hannah, will you look at that bottom question about the freshwater inflows?
Yeah. The question is, what did the heavy rains in Matagorda Bay system this year, 40 plus inches, and the induction of fresh water play a part in your Matagorda numbers? So this is something that we looked into quite a bit, because sea trout have a salinity preference, and if there's fresher water, they'll move to areas that are deeper or have higher salinities. So what that can mean for our gill nets is that the fish are there, they're just not in the areas that we're sampling. They're moving to different parts of the bay. But we were able to do some statistical modeling that takes into effect the salinity of an area, and incorporate that into our analysis. Additionally, we've also looked at the numbers from the fall gillnet catch rates, and we still see a decline in the fall. And those two pieces of information together show that it's while salinity can affect the catch rates, that's not the explanation of why we saw such low catch rates in Matagorda Bay, as well as along the whole coast. There were low salinities in the spring of 2021. So we have looked into that and determined that that's not why we saw, or not the main reason why we saw the low catch rates.
Somebody's asking if we have the map of the catch rates of this past fall in Matagorda Bay. Fall. I don't know that we have Matagorda from the fall mapped out. We do have, oh goodness, Matagorda spring. I know we've looked at that, but we have not. Here's kind of the fall gillnet catch rates. We do have Matagorda. You also see, again, this is that percent decline from the last 10-year average. So you also see within our fall gillnet samples, and again, we don't put as much stock onto our fall gillnets because that's after the harvest season. So you don't know how much harvest has influenced our catch rates. We really put more stock into our spring catch rates, but you can see that some of the catch rates, they mirror and show some similar declines as our spring gillnet samples.
The fall catch rates for Matagorda were a decline of about 30% as well. And that's Matagorda Bay with East Matagorda numbers included.
Thanks, Hannah.
Question, how can we restore our trophy population if we're still able to harvest larger female fish that seem to be more, quote, genetically gifted fish? That the majority of your breeding fish are 12 to 17 inches. A fish over 20 inch would seem to give more eggs and better genes, right? I think there's a misunderstanding about what the proposal on the table. The proposal would not allow any fish in that larger size range. There would be only fish within that slot that 17 to 17 to 20, whatever, 20. 21. So no fish over 21 would be harvested legally.
Probably also worth pointing out there that we don't expect there to be massive differences in the genetics of a 17-inch fish versus an 18-inch fish or a 21-inch fish, genetically speaking. There certainly would be differences in fecundity, but not necessarily the quote unquote good genes.
Yeah, it's a good point.
There's a question, are there plans to give more consideration to shallower bays like East Matagorda for future freeze events? Historical data would suggest that bays will always fare poorly in freeze events. And I think part of this proposal is in some ways proactive, really protecting these sea trout populations and giving them a chance to recover from this event, that will sustain them and ensure that for future freeze events, the population baseline is already at a healthy level. So in a way, this proposal is doing just that.
Yeah. Additionally to that point, of that 10.2 million trout that we stocked coastwide, 3.6 went to Matagorda Bay. Got a great question here. What can the angling community, recreational fishermen to include guides, do to help and improve the fishery to pre-freeze levels and beyond? And I would encourage you, number one, to keep fishing. Keep utilizing the resource. The information we gain from anglers through, just anecdotal reports, creel surveys, through engagements like this, participating and engaging in the public comments and the regulatory process is invaluable. It really is. So I would encourage you, again, keep fishing, stay engaged, and provide us with the input as these opportunities come across.
Yeah, there's a question about 17 and 21. I misspoke. It's 17 and 23 is the proposal.
All right, we've got just a couple of more questions here. I'll answer this one. What percentage of trout fingerlings survive to 15 inches in the wild out of a single trout on average? Probably very, very low. I would guess less than single digits. There's really, in the hatchery setting, that's a little easier to track. But in the wild, I'm really not sure. I would guess it's extremely low, though.
There's a question, how is the mortality of fish caught in that 15 to 17-inch range considered? Is there a risk to these fish once released? So there was a study by Greg Stuntz out of A&M in Corpus, the Heart Research Institute, that found that there's a catch and release mortality for spotted sea trout of about 11% that's consistent across all size classes. So based off of the information we have, we don't see that sort of size selected mortality in that class of fish.
I would add that there have been numerous studies done on spotted sea trout with post-release mortality, and consistently those studies have shown that post-release mortality is fairly low.
Okay, folks, I think I'm gonna wrap it up, and this will conclude our public hearing tonight. Again, I want to thank you all for tuning in virtually and spending some of your evening with us. I know we've got a national championship college football game that kicks off here in 3 minutes. So I do appreciate y'all spending some time with us. Again, please stay engaged. Be sure and submit your public comments through our web portal there. You can also email us, and again, we also also have those 4 in-person public hearings along the coast. Members of our team here today will be at each one of those, and you'll also have some of the local bay system leaders, some of your fisheries management biologists attending each one of those. So look forward to reviewing those comments, summarizing those, and presenting those to the commission. But again, thank you all, and this formally concludes our public hearing. Thank you.